Hello and welcome back to Academic Biology. This is Mr. Adolph, and we're going to pick up where we left off talking about evolution. And I'm going to just quickly review some of the ideas we finished up with in the last lecture, and that was Charles Darwin's idea. So, Charles Darwin is not the only scientist to develop theories on evolution. He's not the only person to develop the theory that he really uses. He's just the person who got to it first, and he is the person that everybody knows as being the developer of evolutionary theory. And it's a good theory, and there's a lot of evidence to support it. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But first, what is his theory? Well, he really had three main ideas to his theory. The first part was natural selection. And natural selection is the idea that the individual supplies the genes. So the species supplies the genes or the traits, and then evolution is what nature is what determines which survives and which doesn't. So the species adapts to the environment. So, for example, we talked about the idea of there's certain factors that are needed for natural selection. You need overproduction, you need variation of genetic traits within a species, you need competition between those individuals, and you also need organisms to die. We also talked about the idea of artificial selection, and Darwin pointed out that this already happens. We already essentially show evolution with artificial selection. And what artificial selection is, in natural selection, nature picks the traits that are going to survive because, if the organism isn't evolved to the environment, it's not going to survive. With artificial selection, humans determine the traits that get passed on. So humans select, or breeders select, which traits are desirable, not the environment. And the example I gave you guys are these little animals right here, dogs, right? Dogs are examples of artificial selection. For the last 10,000 plus years, we have been making dogs designer animals to fit our needs based on what we want them for. Hunting dogs versus guard dogs versus just cute little poodles for looks, So that is a perfect example of artificial selection. And then the last one is the one I did not get to in the last lecture, and that is the idea of survival of the fittest. Now, survival of the fittest is often misconstrued as survival of the strongest. The strong survive. That is not always true. Sometimes being stronger is not an advantage. For example, right now we are dealing with a pandemic, right? We're dealing with a virus that is affecting the entire world. And while it's not deadly for most people, it is still dangerous. So having an immunity against this virus would be a huge advantage. So somebody who has a natural immunity to this virus is going to survive and pass on their genes. And if somebody is predisposed to be sick from it, they're going to not survive. So survival of the fittest doesn't mean survival of the strongest. It means survival of the one who is able to produce the most fertile offspring. So let's say I'm super fit to survive, but I can't reproduce. I am not the fittest because my genes aren't going to get passed on. So even if I survive, my offspring aren't going to be produced, and that trait is not going to get passed down. So survival of the fittest very simply means fit meaning able to survive. So a fast runner might be important in some scenarios, and the ability to breathe underwater might be important in others. So it depends on the situation. It is not always the strongest survive. So those are Darwin's three main ideas: survival of the fittest, artificial selection, and natural selection. Now let's talk a little bit about, okay, so that's your theory, prove it, right? Show me this, because that's a pretty big jump to take. Remember, this was in the 1800s in England. This was not a time where people were very progressive thinking about science. So at this point, a lot of people really didn't accept this theory, this idea that humans evolved. We are these special creatures. How could we have evolved? And that's why you need a lot of evidence to support. So let's get started. The first evidence or form of evidence are going to be fossils. So fossils are a great use of evidence because you can actually see an example of what an organism looked like from a long time ago. So basically, all a fossil is a trace of a long dead organism, something that's been dead for a long time. It's considered a fossil, and it has to have evidence of that fossil being there. So sometimes it's an actual fossilized bone, and that's ideal if you find a bone that is somehow been fossilized. But sometimes it might just be an impression on a rock or a footprint. They find footprints of organisms. But basically, the only way to make a fossil is the organism has to die and it has to quickly be buried by sediment. Because in order for a fossil to form, you have to prevent breakdown from bacteria. And the only way to prevent that is to cut off oxygen and to cut off the sources that bacteria needs to survive. So, for example, when you see a fossil of an organism getting caught, if you've ever seen Jurassic Park, right? You see the mosquito that was trapped in the sap of the tree. The reason why those mosquitoes were able to be trapped like that is because the sap prevents bacteria from breaking that organism down, so that mosquito can survive. Well, not survive, but the evidence of that mosquito, its actual body, is able to be survive over all that time. Now, how can you tell how old something is? Well, there's two main forms of dating a fossil. There's relative dating and there's absolute dating. Relative dating, you're not saying exactly how old it is. You're just saying how old it is in relation to other organisms, or other fossils. So the way it works is they dig down, right? And you learned about this in your environmental science class. Probably talked a little bit about the layers of the earth, or just the idea of it. The earth has formed in layers, right? And these layers are called strata. And when you have an organism that is found in one layer and then another organism that's found in another layer, whichever layer is deeper is older, because these layers form one on top of the other. Think about when you make a sandwich. You put the first slice of bread down, then you put the next slice of meat, and then cheese, and then finally the last piece of bread. You can't start the sandwich with the top piece of bread. It can't just float there. It's got to be built upon the next layer. That is how the layers of the earth form. So if you find something in the first layer, you know it's older than something in the second layer. Absolute dating is using something called half-life. So every single element on the periodic table has something called a half-life. It's the amount of time it takes for half of that material to break down radioactively. So they can tell based on how much of a certain radioactive isotope exists in a rock or in a fossil. They can tell how old it is. Carbon dating is the most widely used, because you can use carbon dating to date a fossil. So you can tell if something's hundreds of thousands of years old, or depending on the type of method you use, you can find if something's millions of years old. So fossils are a great way to determine how old something is and to compare it to other fossils. The next form of evidence is something called a homologous structure. Homo means same, if you remember back to the genetics unit, right? So homologous structure, meaning an anatomical feature, so a hand or a bone. So basically what a homologous structure means is they have similar physical features shared between multiple species, but they do different things. So for example, if you take a look at this image here, you can see all four of these are examples of hands. They all have similar structures. They all have 5 fingers. But if you take a look at them, they have slight differences between them. So the human hand is much meatier and stronger. It's got more muscle there in the palm, and that's because humans hold things, where if you look at a monkey here, the longer fingers are going to be easier for gripping, like grabbing a tree branch. And then a tarsier, which is, you probably have seen these guys before, they have the big giant eyes. They have these like little large surface area at the end of their fingers that helps them stick to things. So even though they have different jobs, they have the same structure. If you look here, you can see these are different animals that have the same bones. So a homologous structure is an example of the same bones, the same physical structure, but different jobs. Another great example would be this diagram here. You can see these are the legs or arm, depending on the animal, of a bunch of different animals. I guess there's no way for me to get this all in one. I'm going to try to negotiate this a little bit here. If you take a look at the top here, you can kind of see the human arm, a horse leg, a cat leg, a bat wing, a bird wing, and a whale's flipper. If you take a look, they all have what is called a humerus. So there's a humerus in all of these. There's a radius, there's an ulna, and then there's the hand bones, which are called the carpals and metacarpals, and then you have your phalanges, which are the fingers. If you take a look, they exist in all of these animals, but they have different jobs. So how is this evidence of evolution? Well, it just shows you that even though these animals all have different functions with these bones, they all have the same bones. It would be like if I opened up a car and I found, let's say I had a truck, I had a Jeep, I had a little tiny, hatchback. They all have very different jobs, right? The truck's for carrying big things, and a Jeep's for going across terrain that you can't drive on in a normal car, and then your hatchback, small economical car. Let's say I had these 3 different types of cars. They look totally different from each other. They have different jobs, but if we open up the engine and they all have the same parts that look exactly the same, you would assume they all came from the same plant, right? They all got made at the same place. That is the idea of homologous structures. even though they have different jobs, they have the same structures. So they all started with the same structures, and then those structures changed over time as they evolved to their environment. And the last thing we're going to talk about today is an analogous structure. Now, homologous structures and analogous structures, they're easy to mix up, and that's why I want to take a minute with that. An analogous structure has a different structure, but a same function. So homology means same. Analogy means like it. So if I use analogies in class a lot to explain concepts. So if you take a look at this diagram here, this shows you a good example of the difference between them. This is homology, the idea that we have a bat wing, we have a mouse forelimb, like the front leg of a mouse, and we have a human arm. All three of these have the same bones, but they have different functions. So same structure, different function. Down here is what we call an analogous structure. That means it has a different structure, but the same function. A bird wing, a butterfly wing, and a bat wing all are built for flight. But if you look at them, a bat wing has bones like an arm. You can see that up here. A butterfly wing doesn't have any bones at all. It's just made up of, thin material called connective tissue. And then bird wing is going to be more similar to a bat wing, but still structurally different. It has feathers on it, and flight is done differently between a bird and a bat. So how is this evidence of evolution? Well, even though all three of these animals are different from each other, as you know, a mammal, an insect, and a bird are very different animals. They all have wings because they all evolved to fly. So analogous structures are great evidence when you see different organisms having similar traits based on where they develop. That's called an analogous structure. So a homologous structure is a structure that has the same structure but a different function. An analogous structure has a different structure but the same function. Another good example would be like a fin on a fish versus a fin on a whale. They have the same purpose. They're for swimming, but they have a little bit of a different structure bone-wise. And that's all we're going to cover for this lesson. Thank you.